Good morning. I declare the Kemper Lecture open. Please turn off all cell phones.
Please be seated. I ask you to be prepared this morning. My invocation will take at least 20 minutes. April Fools. And let us pray. We stand in awe of that which is holy in the world, and beyond the world, and in ourselves. All the world's religious and spiritual traditions teach that giving is one of the primary virtues of a good and meaningful life. Christianity is among these, and we recall this day the words of Jesus that it is better to give than to receive. However, this advice may fall on deaf ears, the way seeds fall on a barren, infertile soil. Without nourishment, the seeds do not take root and grow. Without reception, the words fall down and are blown away and die. But in our inner awareness, we know that these words are true. And we think of examples in the world and examples in our individual lives of persons who gave, and in that giving, found meaning and goodness. Jesus, the Buddha, Muhammad, Moses, Confucius all believed that giving brought people immense satisfaction, so they all gave from the depths of their being. And in more recent times, your servant and this institute's namesake, Winston Churchill, gave of his heart, his mind, his body, and his soul. And so today we revere giving. There are persons in this beautiful sanctuary who have given of their time, their talents, and their treasures to noble causes, to worthy organizations, to needy people, and to deserving institutions. We thank you for their willingness to give. And especially we are thankful for our speaker, Jon Meacham, who has given of his time, his expertise, his passion, and his talent. He could have been anywhere today, and he chose to be with us. In this month of April, beginning today, when Christians are engaged in Lent, approaching Easter, when the civil rights movement is preparing to remember the 49th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King, when Jews are anticipating Passover, and when Buddhists are prepared to celebrate the birthday of Siddhartha Gautama, we remember the closing words of the prayer of St. Francis. Let us seek not so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it's in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
Good morning. I have entitled my welcoming comments, Perseverance, Steadfastness in the Face of Adversity. Faculty, staff, students, alumni, friends, community members, Churchill Fellows, I am indeed pleased to welcome you to this gathering today. It is a great honor to welcome our special guest, Pulitzer Prize winner, Jon Meacham, and retired General and former CIA Director, David Petraeus. We stand here in the sacred and storied place to celebrate, as we have done annually for nearly 50 years, the life and the legacy of Sir Winston Churchill and his long-lasting and continuing connection to Westminster College. 71 years ago, my friends, Winston Churchill and President Harry S. Truman arrived at Westminster, a place that the president famously referred to as a wonderful school in my home state. And while Churchill's visit to Westminster was brief, less than 24 hours, the message he delivered from here to the world in what is famously referred to as the Iron Curtain speech has become one of the most significant leadership lessons of all time. Churchill's words inspired us then, and even more so today, to remain steadfast, vigilant in the face of adversity. 71 years may seem to be a long time, but it is still a living memory for a few individuals who are among us today. And here with us are two men who were witnesses to Winston Churchill's monumental address on March 5, 1946. It is my honor to recognize Westminster alumnus Baxter Watson and a prince of a man from St. Louis, Earl Robertson. Baxter and Earl, I ask you to stand and be recognized. Thank you. The decision to invite Winston Churchill to America's heartland was bold and ambitious, but so too was Churchill's charge to the world in the celebrated Iron Curtain speech. At the time, no one, with the possible exception of Churchill himself, could foresee the profound impact that the speech would have on the course of world events. Churchill's deeds and words were infectious. And in the aftermath of this powerful oration, Westminster found the courage of its conviction. Indeed, it was an ambitious and bold act to create a permanent memorial and museum honoring Churchill by relocating from London, England to Fulton, Missouri. This magnificent Christopher Wren designed church of St. Mary the Virgin of Aldermanbury. And when this church was rededicated and the museum was established in 1969, Westminster College began the practice of recognizing and honoring individuals who demonstrate extraordinary efforts to uphold the hallowed place and to preserve Churchill's legacy of leading from where you are. The men and the women whom we have honored since constitute the Association of Churchill's Fellows of Westminster College, an illustrious group that counts among its 298 members individuals who have and continue to dedicate their lives and their livelihood to overcome those seemingly insurmountable challenges we face here in America and around the world. Past Churchill Fellows include President Dwight Eisenhower, Walter Cronkite, Margaret Thatcher, J.C. Penney, Sir David Cannondine, Lady Mary Soames, Richard Mahoney, Edwina Sandys, Monroe Trout, and Kit Bond, just to mention a few. And I know that Kit Bond, Edwina, Dick Mahoney, and Jean Paul Montauban, and Bob Mulhauser and others distinguished Churchill members are with us today. And so I ask that they all stand and be recognized, please. Churchill's Fellows of Westminster College are ambassadors of Churchill's legacy, and all of us here are indeed grateful for their continued good work and their leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, vision, resilience, boldness, these are qualities of Winston Churchill's leadership that we hold dear here at Westminster College. And in short, we ask that those who teach and all those who come here to learn go forth to change the world, or perhaps even to save it. That is our mission. That is our purpose. It is the promise that we make. And it is from this historic place then and even now that we learn lessons from our past so that we may not repeat and make the same mistakes over and over again. But even today, we continue to face the iron curtain of intolerance, and we grapple with looming threats and stormy clouds of extremism that impede our journey towards Churchill's characterization as broad sunlight uplands. However, gatherings like this instill in us our collective determination to move from hopelessness to a brighter future that we create for ourselves and surely for others. Today we will hear from two remarkable speakers who will share perspectives on what leadership looks like and what leaders can do to enable the journey from success to significance. Both of our speakers are recognized for their visionary thinking. Both are students of history, and they have shared and applied lessons of the past to create the path forward along the high roads of the future, to borrow a phrase used by Churchill as he closed his speech here 71 years ago. I am delighted that Jon Meacham and General Petraeus are here with us today to inform, to challenge, and to inspire us. And finally, it is my honor to welcome back to Fulton another inspiring, bold, historically minded, and talented force of nature, a Churchill Fellow of Westminster College, artist, author, and friend, a Churchillian by birth and in deeds, Edwina Sandys. And even when you are far away from Fulton, Edwina, we feel that a part of you is always with us because of your monumental sculpture, Breakthrough, comprised of sections of the Berlin Wall, which sits here at Westminster College since 1990. And I see that our museum has lent you a replica of the scarlet Oxford robe that your grandfather wore when he was here. I won't be the first to say it, but you look resplendent. Edwina, your work along with your grandfather's legacy reminds us all that of all the lessons that history teaches us, the most valuable takeaway is that freedom requires perseverance and steadfastness in the face of adversity. And so, Edwina, I thank you for serving as the senior fellow for today's installation ceremony. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Churchill Fellow and devoted Churchillian, Edwina Sandys.
Well, thank you, Benjamin. That is a wonderful introduction. I'm very pleased with it. Now, I do say that you are thoroughly Churchillian yourself, and you're a great speaker, and I know my grandfather would have liked to have heard you speak and shake your wonderful hand. Now, I think Grandpapa, he would have been pleased to have been here today and would like to have met all these wonderful people, especially the two speakers. But he is in our hearts, and therefore his spirit is with us. And now I'm honored to be here today acting as the senior fellow I've been pushed upstairs, and I'm pleased to welcome the following individuals into the Association of Churchill Fellows of Westminster College. Harold Oakley. Don't I going to have a thing? Oh. I thought I was going to do it. I wanted to do it. I thought they were going to come up here and let me put it round their necks. Lee Pollock. Richard Marsh. William Rhodey. My nephew, Duncan Sands. Hey. David Petraeus. Benjamin Akande. Now let me do that. We've got one more, haven't we? Jon Meacham. Thank you very much. Is that okay? Wasn't that nice?
President Akande, Chairman Montupet, members of the Churchill family, sans division, fellow fellows, inductees. In 2003, with the publication of Franklin and Winston, an intimate portrait of an epic friendship, Jon Meacham started on the pathway to becoming one of the premier biographers in our nation, and indeed of our nation. Another one of our great English language biographers, Richard Holmes, recently said, perhaps one of the best diagnostics of biography, that it is a celebration of human nature in all its contradictions, and so it is with all of Jon Meacham's great books. In his wonderful biography of Thomas Jefferson, he sets the scene of an election in 1800 that may seem far away and yet may seem oh so close, between Federalists and Republicans. In all their viciousness and extremity, our current election might seem a family picnic by comparison, if you have a family like mine. With Hamilton, Adams, and even Jefferson himself ready to believe and incite conspiracy, looking for violence, condemning the motives of men they had built the nation with. In the midst of this existential conflict, Jefferson wonders if his life has been of benefit to mankind, and he makes a list that Meacham shares with us of his accomplishments: the Declaration of Independence and the revision of the laws of Virginia, coupled with the improved navigation of the Rivanna River and the introduction to America of the olive tree. Having reduced Jefferson, as he does with all of his subjects, to his basic humanity, to the olives and Jefferson gave us, he then gives us a set-piece narrative informed by that humanity, goes through the 36 ballots in the House of Representatives, and then he gives us the first inaugural address. Brilliantly, Meacham gives it to us whole, for what a guide it is to us today. Not only the famous line, we are all Republicans, we are all Democrats, Federalists, but also the will of the majority in all cases to prevail, but that will to be rightful must be reasonable. And stating his belief, Jefferson's belief, the government is the only one, our government is the only one where every man at the call of the law would fly to the standard of the law. Sentiments which in Jon Meacham's great set piece end with Hamilton, Marshall, and Adams responding to Jefferson. As Meacham says, his words, with grace, civility, and respect. Oh, that everyone in Washington would read this chapter of his book. In his Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Andrew Jackson, American Lion, he takes on the most disreputable aspect of Jackson's political career, his Indian policy. He quotes his message to the Creeks, portraying himself as their trusted father, saying to them, "This is straight and good talk." Meacham says, but it was only straight, not good. And I say that Meacham is certainly always both straight and good. His book about religion and the making of our nation, American Gospel, is both a celebration of the diverse but powerful influences on the founders of their relations with God and Providence. And in his words, also the counterbalancing of complexity and humility, tolerance and reverence, contrasted to the fear and certitude of fanaticism, another lesson for us. Great biography is of necessity both a search for the truth and an artful reimagining of the past. But the greatest trait of all for a biographer is empathy. No current biographer better displays that talent. Editor of Newsweek and the Washington Monthly, on the board of Monticello, Doctor of Humane Letters awarded by the Yale Divinity School, member of the vestry of Trinity Church, brilliant biographer of our nation's troubled but aspirational soul. Ladies and gentlemen, Jon Meacham.
Given the setting, the music, and those kind words, we could just go ahead and make this either my funeral or the world's first Episcopalian bar mitzvah. I'm open to either. Thank you, Mr. President, Chaplain, Mr. Kemper, General Petraeus, Ms. Sands, my friend Ambassador Burt Walker, who also represents a family that has rendered invaluable service to the cause of freedom at America and abroad. I'm honored to be here. Those words were so warm, and I was sitting there thinking, well, I really think he's got a point. And my mind went back very quickly, you'll appreciate this, Reverend, to a moment 8 years ago on the Washington Mall. And I was on my way at that point to give my talk about Andrew Jackson. And a woman ran up to me, which doesn't happen enough as a basic rule, and said, "Oh my God, it's you." And I said, "Well, yes." Existentially speaking, that's hard to argue with. And this may be the only place in Missouri I can use existential as an adverb. I say that as a Tennessean. We can't use it anywhere, so it's all right. She said, "I want you to sign your new book. Will you wait right here?" And I said, "Absolutely, yes, ma'am." And I was standing there thinking, the world is really right where I want it. Women are running up. They want me to sign the book. I'm just standing there thinking, sort of like that introduction. Really, everything is on pace. Hand to God, she brought back John Grisham's latest novel. So, true story. True story. So whenever I think that a warm introduction may actually be on point, I remind myself that somewhere in America there is a woman with a forged copy of The Runaway Jury. So, humility, humility, humility. Memento mori, I think they call it. We are here to commemorate a very human hero. Winston Leonard Churchill is one of the most remarkable human beings who ever drew breath. We live in the light of his achievement. We are in his debt forever for the courage he showed in a dismal season that has known few parallels in the history of man. I would like to start, if I may, on the 10th of May, 1940, a Friday in London, when at last, the call came. He's 65 years old. He's grown old in his nation's service. He has, as you know, changed parties not once but twice, prompting him to say, "Anyone can rat, but it takes character to re-rat." He is summoned to the palace. He accepts the prime ministership. And as he later recalled in his war memoirs, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and all my life had been but preparation for this hour and for this trial. I was sure I should not fail." It is a remarkable sentence. Historical truth requires us to point out that he was among the few people who thought he would not fail. And that included the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, who at that very hour was holding a cabinet meeting in Washington. This is a distant time. They actually worked then. And so Roosevelt, to keep the cabinet in town, would have cabinet meetings on Friday afternoon. And he was handed a message saying that Churchill had become prime minister. And he looked up and said to his cabinet, with every expectation it would be reported, "Well, I suppose Winston is the best man England has, even if he is drunk half the time." So this did not begin well. What became the greatest alliance and the greatest friendship, I believe, in the history of the free world, was a love story with rough patches. And I owe Mary Soames many things, but one of the things when I was doing this book, now almost 20 years ago, we were sitting in her flat in London talking about her father and President Roosevelt, and she said that whenever she thought of the president and Papa, she thought of the French proverb, "In love there's always one who kisses and one who offers the cheek." And Papa was always kissing, and FDR was always offering the cheek. And it was a brilliant encapsulation of that relationship. It went through stages. There was a need on the part of Churchill to bring Roosevelt into the war. Once America was finally there, as the Prime Minister put it, he was, after it was over, he worded a fairly tough message to Roosevelt, and one of his aides said, "Prime Minister, I'm not sure you should speak quite that way to the President." And the Prime Minister said, "Oh, when we're wooing, we speak one way. When they're in the harem, quite a different way." And so it was just, the sexual metaphor is not entirely mine. Since I've been prayed for, I want to make that clear. So then they had this marvelous friendship where they were, as a fellow White House guest called them in January of 1942, they were like a couple of emperors, fighting for the common cause, fighting for what was then known as the United Nations. That lasted almost 2 years until the complications of the Stalin relationship came and created difficulties between Roosevelt and Churchill. But they always maintained, I believe, a deep bond of genuine affection and genuine respect. Roosevelt once said to Churchill, "It's fun to be in the same decade with you." And I've often thought what fun it would have been to be in the same decade with Winston Churchill. The mechanics of memory are a complicated business. We are here to celebrate and to commemorate, but we're also here to learn. And to learn, as Churchill himself once said, requires discriminating criticism. He once wrote that undiscriminating praise, like gush, is always insipid. So we need to look at the past not up at it adoringly, nor down on it condescendingly, as if we were morally superior, but look the past in the eye and take them for what they were, take them for the constraints they faced, the possibilities they envisioned, and the legacies they left us. And Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt left us nothing less than liberty. For we forget, I think, at our peril, how tenuous the democratic experiment was in the 1930s. Winston Churchill didn't have a problem. In 1933, he wrote a profile of Roosevelt in which he said that Roosevelt was the shining hope between the baleful lights emanating either from Nazified Germany or Bolshevik Moscow. And that Roosevelt, who, because of his physical incapacity, was someone who would be a formidable figure for any man who could recover from being struck down by polio at the age of 39 and yet rise to the pinnacle of the great republic, would always be a man to be reckoned with. So too would the author of those words. Democracy was in the dock in the 1930s. One of the best-selling books in America was by Anne Morrow Lindbergh, called The Wave of the Future. And the wave of the future was not democratic capitalism. It was, in her view, a kind of European totalitarianism. It was in 1933 when Franklin Roosevelt delivered his epic inaugural address saying that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That received applause on the Capitol lawn, but there was another line that received a more energetic, a more bloodthirsty, if you will, reaction. It was that he might call for wartime powers to preserve democracy if the situation deteriorated during the Depression. Eleanor Roosevelt was fundamentally disturbed when she heard the passion of the crowd approving of the possibility that the president would overreach his authority. That was the world in which they lived and governed. Franklin Roosevelt was a politician. He was someone who followed public opinion incredibly closely. He was therefore not as quick, not as swift to the cause that Churchill embodied. which was ultimately, in 1940, Churchill standing on one side of the English Channel saying that Adolf Hitler had gone that far and would go no farther, and that he would rather die choking in his own blood upon the ground than to be the first generation of Britons to live as slaves. So that leads us, I want to offer a couple of lessons. We commemorate, we celebrate, but we must learn. The first lesson that I believe emerges from Churchill's leadership is the absolute centrality of courage. Aristotle once said it is the chief virtue because it guarantees all the others. And because we are in an ecclesiastical setting, I think it's appropriate to read what is not quite sacred text yet, but the Churchill Fellows are working on this. This is the speech, the section of the speech that the Prime Minister delivered. Franklin Roosevelt was listening to it with a speechwriter, Sam Rosenman, drinking cold milk and cold fried chicken in the White House, still trying to decide in June of 1940 whether Churchill could be trusted, whether this man who had seemed erratic, had had a career of ups and downs, had resigned from the cabinet in the First World War and returned to the front to fight in France. Could America trust this man to carry through on his own rhetoric? So he sat in the White House listening to what is the text of modern defiance. Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing strength and growing confidence in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And even if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would step forward to carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the new world in all its power and might will come forth to the rescue and liberation of the old. The text of defiance, arguably the most famous words he ever spoke, ends with a kind of humility that required courage. It ends with a prayer. It ends with a prayer that someday, in extremis, Franklin Roosevelt, that's what he meant when he said the new world in all its power and might, will come forth to the rescue and liberation of the old. It requires a strong man, the most courageous of men, to acknowledge that there is the possibility that more help will be required. That text is often read as the boldest of defiant rhetoric, and it is. But it ends with a prayer, and it takes a strong man to offer a prayer in that hour. We must have courage, and Winston Churchill embodied that. We also, and I don't know if this will resonate with anybody here, we also need some candor. And in this covenant of modern democracies, the leaders and the followers have to believe one another. Hashtag necessary relationship. And Roosevelt and Churchill both got this. Franklin Roosevelt had a more ambiguous relationship with the truth than Winston Churchill did. Just ask Mrs. Roosevelt. But it's a good thing these are not the Roosevelt Fellows. Making sure the Honorable Miss Sands is smiling. She might rip the whole thing off. The shortest Episcopal bar mitzvah in history. But they understood that the covenant of democracies was, if you give it to us straight, we'll do what it takes. And so in January of 1942, in a largely forgotten episode, Churchill returns from the White House, returns from that remarkable Christmas where he first encountered "O Little Town of Bethlehem," a Christmas carol. He comes home to a disastrous situation. He has to defend himself in the House of Commons. He writes a long, long defense. Singapore is falling. We have no capital ships in the Atlantic. This is the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. And in his memoirs, he talks about how in his 10,000-word defense of his conduct of the war, he talks about why that was important. And he said that, and this applies to the American people as well, the British people can face any misfortune with fortitude and buoyancy as long as they are convinced that those who are in charge of their affairs are not deceiving them or are not themselves dwelling in a fool's paradise. Give it to us straight and we'll do what it takes. But we must know the reality of the situation. We must understand the scope of the struggle. In February of 1942, on Washington's birthday, Franklin Roosevelt delivered a fireside chat in which he quoted Thomas Paine, who said that tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. And then he said, echoing his friend Winston Churchill, the American people deserve to have it straight from the shoulder. The news is going to get worse and worse before it gets better and better. But we must level with the people. Give it to us straight, and we'll rise to the occasion. Deceive us, offer overly rosy views, and you will break the bond of trust in an ultimate and existential hour. And Roosevelt and Churchill understood that and practiced that. Candor as an element of democratic leadership, lowercase d, particularly in wartime, is absolutely essential. Cooperation. As Churchill said famously, the only thing worse than having them is not having them, in terms of allies. They had their moments. They were immensely fond of each other, as I said. They spent Christmas together, Thanksgiving together, their wedding anniversaries together, which their wives loved. They spent 113 days together during the war, exchanged nearly 2,000 letters. And they fished together, drank together, occasionally too much in Eleanor's view, but that's beside the point. That's a low bar. It is also true that it is kind of remarkable that we're not all speaking German. Franklin Roosevelt's idea of a martini was 3/4 vermouth, 1/4 gin. And yet we won the war. At Christmas 1940, so he would give these, the prime minister, as we know, drank, had scotch and Paul Roger. You know, he had good taste, as opposed to the American wasps who don't. I can say that as a representative of the tribe. And he would actually pour Jock Colville told the story, Churchill would pour these awful martinis out in a plant. And because he would stay for 2 or 3 weeks, the plant would die. So maybe we could, part of Lend-Lease, we could get that back. You owe us a fern, ma'am. And they would, Roosevelt smoked cigarettes, as you know. He didn't like cigars particularly, but they would stay up all night. Roosevelt would complain sometimes that his sleep was being interrupted when Churchill was in the White House because he would come up with an idea in the middle of the night and pad down the hall and come into the bedroom. And he once said, you know, Winston has 100 ideas a day, but to be fair, about 60 of them are great. So pretty good batting average. But the idea of cooperation, the idea that we are stronger together, the idea, as Roosevelt said in his final inaugural, that, quoting Emerson, that the best way to have a friend is to be one, was embodied in the Churchillian vision of alliance. And I wanted to give you a bit from the Harvard speech in 1943. It was Monday, September 6th, 1943. Roosevelt had very much wanted the academic ceremonial at Harvard to be up to British standards. And Lord Moran wrote that I think Roosevelt has been sticking pins into the president of Harvard to get great robes. Churchill receives an honorary degree at Harvard and says this: "Twice in my lifetime, the long arm of destiny has searched across the oceans and involved the entire life and manhood of the United States in a deadly struggle. There is no use saying, we don't want it, we won't have it. Our forebears left Europe to avoid these quarrels. We have founded a new world which has no contact with the old. There is no use in that. The long arm reaches out remorselessly, and everyone's existence, everyone's environment, everyone's outlook undergo a swift and irresistible change. Why, Churchill asked, has this fate befallen America? He said this: I will offer you one explanation. There are others, but one will suffice. The price of greatness is responsibility. If the people of the United States had continued in a mediocre station, struggling with the wilderness, absorbed in their own affairs, and a factor of no consequence in the movement of the world, they might have remained forgotten and undisturbed beyond their protecting oceans. But one cannot rise to be in many ways the leading community in the civilized world without being involved in its problems, without being convulsed by its agonies, and inspired by its causes. If this has been proved in the past, as it has been, it will become indisputable in the future. The people of the United States cannot escape world responsibility. And the people of Britain and America must stand together. He said, there is no halting place at this point. We have now reached a stage in the journey where there can be no pause. We must go on. It must be world anarchy or world order. Throughout all this ordeal and struggle which is characteristic of our age, you will find in the British Commonwealth and Empire good comrades to whom you are knighted by other ties besides those of state policy and public need. To a large extent, they are the ties of blood and history. Naturally, I, a child of both worlds, am conscious of these. We could not be isolationist, and we could not go it alone. We were stronger together. Two wings took flight. He believed that firmly. Roosevelt had a slightly more complicated vision about the United Nations, but in his heart, he knew that when his back was against the wall, Churchill would be the one who would be with him. The current moment in our country is one that I think should give and has given almost all of us who think historically a significant amount of pause. The current president has drawn comparisons to himself and Andrew Jackson, a man I wrote a book about. A quick story. A couple weeks ago, President Trump came to Nashville to lay a wreath at the tomb of Andrew Jackson. And I wrote an open letter to the president for the local newspaper, arguing that I hoped he would pay less attention to Jackson's temperamental legacy, which would be redundant at this point. The hair is good, that matches. And more to Jackson's enormous commitment to the American Union. And a day later, my phone rang, and it was George Herbert Walker Bush, the 41st president, who called and said, and I said, read your letter to Jackson. I said, well, Mr. President, thank you. It's great to hear from you. Sir, it was to Trump about Jackson. And he said, yeah, but Jackson will pay more attention. It's a true story. He'll be 93 years old on June 12th. Bob Hope has nothing on this guy. But and I also think the movement from George Herbert Walker Bush to Donald Trump, to paraphrase Henry Adams, disproves Darwin in many ways. But what we have to hope for, and it's easy to be clever about this, and the fruit is low-hanging, but fruit tastes good. But we celebrate Churchill, we commemorate him, we learn from him. What Winston Churchill represented was a deep seriousness about politics, about the existence and endurance of liberty under law, of what he called the title deeds of freedom. He once said, "The future is unknowable, but the past should give us hope." Future is unknowable, but the past should give us hope. And I think if we don't have a Churchillian sense of the past, for unfolding in that formidable mind of his was this great pageant of British history. The sense that from Magna Carta forward, from Runnymede to his stand against Hitler, all the way into the Cold War and the Iron Curtain, was that ultimately there was an Anglo-American, ultimately a Western movement toward, in the words of the American Constitution, towards a more perfect union. And he was able to imagine it, he was able to see it, because he knew where the journey had begun. And I would urge all of us, in our way, in whatever possibility in whatever corner we find to brighten, to ask that those whom we put in charge of our affairs, to quote Churchill, to have a sense of history, to have a sense that we are part of an ongoing stream. We are not like Miranda in The Tempest, "O brave new world that has such people in it." And remember what her father said, "'Tis new to thee." There is no thing new under the sun, saith the preacher. And that does not mean that we find, by reading about Churchill, by pondering Franklin Roosevelt, by thinking about Harry Truman, here's exactly what we should do about Putin. History doesn't work that way. History is a diagnostic tool. It's not a how-to book. If things have happened in a certain way, then it is likely they might happen that way again. And that creates perspective. And it creates the capacity, and Winston Churchill embodied this, the capacity to judge the circumstances of the hour, not as if they all descended from the sky today, but which are in fact part of the running history of our times. And I think that is one way to honor Winston Churchill every day moving forward. I'll leave you with his final major speech to the House of Commons. He was elected, as you'll remember, when Queen Victoria was still on the throne. And gave this speech in the 1950s about the hydrogen bomb. He said, "To conclude, mercifully, there is time and hope if we combine patience and courage. The day may dawn when fair play, love for one's fellow men, respect for justice and freedom will enable tormented generations to march forth serene and triumphant from the hideous epoch in which we have to dwell. Meanwhile, never flinch, never weary, never despair." Wise words then, and wise words now. Thank you.
Jon Meacham, thank you very much for those wise words and inspiring words in this wonderful place. As a token of our thanks, we would like to present to you a number of items, namely this item. Please stand. This is an original ticket to the Iron Curtain speech, March 5th, 1946, which admitted one to the gymnasium here on campus.
Wow.
So this is your ticket to return.
This is excellent.
We also have another item that Edwina Sands has graciously created and given to you, an original print signed of one of her works called Finest Hours.
I'll be back next month if you want anything else you want to give me. Great stuff. If you have, I'll take the podium if you want. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you to stand, please, for the benediction and remain standing for the adjournment and then the recessional. Let us pray. And now may we leave this place blessed by all that is good, liberated by all that is true, inspired by all that is noble, and grateful for all that is given. Amen.
I declare the Kemper Lecture closed. Please remain standing for the recessional.